Your organization, the Movement for the Socialist Alternative, has shown its weight behind the Nigerian Labour's Congress and the TUC's ongoing strike. Let me start by asking what your response is to the criticism that the demand by labor for a minimum wage of over 400,000 is not only outrageous but economically unviable.
Well, let me say that for members of the ruling class, and I use this word members of the ruling class because Tinubu as an individual, this is not just about Tinubu, the entirety of the ruling class. The headlines today has announced that members of the National Assembly have just received an 100 million 2023 Toyota model car, and according to them, it will allow them to be able to move across Nigerians, to be able to know what is happening to Nigerians. And this is just one of the largest that senators within a 1-year period have gone away with. We have not forgotten that Iningi was suspended for a period of 77 days, you know, for coming publicly to announce that members of the National Assembly, alongside their friends in the executive, made away with over 3 trillion naira of what? Of the budget as largest, and they shared it among themselves. We must also not forget that Mr. President provided Christmas and end of year packages to all members of the National Assembly, running to over 200 million naira each. You know, then they also receive palliatives. This is outside the fact that they receive fantastic wages that amount to over 20 million naira monthly. So if all of this is not outrageous and it's not collapsing the Nigerian economy, how is it that the quest to earn a wage that will keep somebody alive, how can that be outrageous? We must return back to statistics to know what this figure is ultimately. And I want Nigerians, members of the general public, to know the fact that workers, the mass of the working masses, are not responsible for the microeconomic policies that has placed Nigeria where it is currently today. In 1981, the minimum wage in Nigeria was 125 naira, with $1.61 kobo. The workers were earning $205. So, have you now, and Mr. President promised workers that he was going to give them a living wage. You know, so how is 48,000 naira a living wage? Interestingly, if we were to calculate the dollar figure of what 48,000 amounts to, sincerely speaking, it is completely ridiculous. And they have now upped it to 60,000 naira. Okay. What is 60,000 naira? 60,000 naira in dollar value is $40. The labor leaders have asked government to give us a table of how you are going to spend 60,000 naira. And let's just give ourselves an example. A sliced bread today in Nigeria, the least quality is 1,200 naira. I'm not talking of, you know, going for 2,500 naira. And that is just for breakfast. You are not going to just eat bread alone. If you want to attempt to fry egg and have egg, bread and egg, we have not talked about tea now in the morning. You have expected one to. A egg currently in Nigeria is 200 naira. If you have a family of 4, and you want to manage 3 eggs, that will be 600 naira. You have already expended 1,800 naira. We have not talked of the oil you use. If you use the sachet shell, which is 250 naira, that is 2,500 naira. If you say that you have used a gas of 150, at the end of the day, you are talking about 2,500 naira for a minimal breakfast of bread and egg. We have not included tea. If you have to calculate that for 30 days at 2,500 naira, you'll be talking about 50,000 naira. How do you offer a minimum wage that is not even enough for a family of 4 to take breakfast as things are currently? And that is the absurdity of the current characters of the ruling class that are presiding over the affairs of Nigeria. And we must not mind words. Other sections, other wings of the ruling class might not be any different. This is Mr. President, who is not a millionaire. He is a billionaire. When I say he's a billionaire, Nigerians should not mistake me to be thinking that I'm saying he's a billionaire in naira. Let's cast our mind back to the way and manner he won the ticket to be the presidential candidate. He spent dollars to earn that ticket. So it means that if you are to value if you are to praise the appropriate value of Mr. President in naira, he is a trillionaire. And yes, Mr. President has not announced to us in his magnanimous spirit that he will not earn any kobo from the wealth of Nigeria as president, that he will serve Nigeria pro bono as elected president. This is the same country where we have had retired generals. If you know what it means to be a retired general in Nigeria, what you earn. And interestingly, these two retired generals were former head of states. For one day in their office in 8 years, they never told Nigerians that they were not going to earn a single kobo and that they would serve Nigeria in pro bono. Even when Nigerians were still fantastically paying them retired benefits, that was enough. If they wanted to live twice their current lifespan without going in hunger, they appropriated with fantastic wages to themselves. You know, so these are the realities. And if appropriating with fantastic wages to themselves does no problem to the economy, how is it that when it comes to those who lay the golden goose, the golden egg, you know, the mass of the working people who sweat, who toil day and night, you know, that this is what will collapse the economy. Now, we should make it quite clear to them that Nigeria is rich enough to pay a living wage to its people, and that if this ruling class is not serious, it must begin to pack its bags and leave, and allow people who can run the affairs of this country, allow the mass of the working people to get themselves organized and take over the reign of political power and begin to transform the Nigerian society for all of us.
Now, let me get your perspective on this. I mean, you clearly pointed out some of this, you know, statistical analysis. Now, how does your organization, the Movement for the Socialist Alternative, actually perceive the Tinubu's regime's stance on minimum wage and its broader economic policies, particularly in relation to wealth distribution and access to resources?
Now, let me straight away say that the Tinubu regime is not any different from all of the previous regimes we've had. Indeed, it is a continuation of these regimes in terms of economic policies. But the painful thing is that we have a brand of ruling class in Nigeria that is unwilling to sit down and learn from its own failures. The Babangida regime introduced what was known as the Structural Adjustment Program, you know, in 1986-87. Even if Nigerians in their millions rejected this program, the Babangida regime imposed it. And from then on, through the programs, and what are these programs? Deregulation, privatization, devaluations of the current and liberalization of what of the economy. These things have not worked since 1986-87. It failed. The modernized version that Obasanjo introduced, and it's important to return back to Obasanjo because Obasanjo was on this other side criticizing the Babangida regime, calling for a sap for a human face. Capitalism has no human face. It is only interested in appropriating capital. Not capital for the neo-colonial countries, but capital for Western imperialism. And of course, we must begin to include China in this game when we mention imperialism now, because these are the new industrial heartlands of the world, the US, Europe, and China. And what they do with all of their policies is to ensure that the new colonial world does not compete with it. And you have a ruling class that is tied to implementing this program to the latter. And this is why it is not strange. The ruling class in Nigeria is not interested, is not involved in industrialization. Because if it were interested, if it was involved in industrialization, it will play the role to increasing the purchasing power of the mass of the working people. And how do you increase the purchasing powers of the working people? It is through giving them living wages, so that they would be able to use their wages to work, to buy these goods and services. The entirety of the Nigerian economy is an importing committee. It is an importing nation. So you have a ruling class that is satisfied to sit on top of the wealth of the country and collect crumbs and collect as agent for Western imperialism and China. This fundamentally is why not just the Tinubu regime, the entirety of the ruling class is unwilling to provide appropriate living wage. Again, you must understand that as part of his liberalization policies, as part of his first program of inviting foreign investors, it must make wage, as poor as what? As possible. But the truth is that where are these foreign investors? Where are they? And this is what we must challenge. We must make it quite clear. We have not had to wait for 1 year to know that the Tinubu regime will be a failure. And when I use the word failure, I mean in terms of addressing the living conditions of the mass of the working people. And the conditions of the mass of the working people cannot be improved if the economy is not developing. And for the economy to develop, the first step is to break away from the policies and programs of the World Bank and the IMF. And this is where it's important to put forward that the current struggle for a new minimum wage ultimately is not going to fundamentally resolve the existing contradictions. While for a while, it will create the illusion that something has been done. It is important. And this is not to mean that this general strike for a new minimum wage is not important. I think it is important. We support it. We endorse it. And we call on the mass of the Nigerian people to provide all the necessary support for this strike. We saw what happened yesterday following the visit, following the invitation of the SFG, and how we are told that Nuhu Rubadu, brought soldiers to surround it. What is the National Security Officer looking for in a meeting with labor leaders and government to negotiate what a new minimum wage is? They must not create the impression that workers are the threat to this government. This threat is the greatest threat. It is its own threat to itself. In refusing to carry out policies that will develop and improve the living conditions of the mass of the working people, it endangers itself, it endangers bourgeois democracy, and it endangers the continuing survival of the Nigerian state. And this will not be taken as an empty threat. Because as long as you continue to implement policies that create an entrenched penury in the mass of the working people, you create the necessary dangers for movements that are uncontrolled. And we can see all of those various, quote unquote, negative movements in all parts of the country. Yeah. The East today, with various secessionist groups, and which is why it's painful and unfortunate. The incident in Imo, where gallant military soldiers were shot down and killed. The fault must not be placed on workers, on people living in Imo. The fault must be placed on the ruling class themselves, who have refused to carry all of the necessary steps to ensure that the necessary industrialization is taking place, the necessary job opportunities for all of the millions of employees is taking place, and we can begin a clear shift away from the neoliberal capitalist policies in Nigeria.
Now, let me get your perspective on this. What strategies do you think Labour should propose for achieving the over 400,000? Actually, as a matter of fact, they agreed with the federal government yesterday that they will be paying above 60,000, anything above that. So what strategies do you think should be put forward or proposed for achieving a minimum wage, and how does it envision the role of workers in this process? Yes, sir.
Now let me point out that labor, we must see labor from 2 points. First, from the trade unions, and for the entirety of the mass of the working people. Labor must realize, and let me say this, and when I say this, I do not say this in any defeatist sense. The movement for socialist alternative have never supported the idea of an indefinite general strike. And the reason for this is clear. We think this pretentious claim to think there is a one and final struggle with the ruling class, when you are ultimately going to return back to negotiate with them, creates a false impression. But you are not wrong to identify that a strike, a general strike as we currently have, is a mobilizing instrument for the cause of transforming the Nigerian society. It offers education to the mass of the working people that they constitute the only threat to the working class. I mean, they constitute the only threat to the ruling class. And that if they become more organized, if they mobilize all the strength of their force, they could provide leadership to the entirety of the mass to take on the ruling class. And this, for me, is why I think this general strike is supported. It must be fully supported. But you have raised, what should be the strategy? What should be the approach and program to adopt to see if a minimum wage can be won? But don't forget that we have pointed out that even a 1 million minimum wage will not resolve this contradiction.
That's right.
And that capitalism, the crude form of which we practice, again, the capitalism we have in Nigeria, in the neo-colonial Africa, is not even the capitalism you have in the US,
Far from it.
which is sourcing capital out into Asia, developing industries and controlling those industries. Industries are not developed here. So you have gangs of so-called big business proponents here in Nigeria, with Dangote as the leading chair of big business in the country. And the analysis in relation to how the refinery, Dangote refinery, is constructed explains what capitalism is here. They are fronts for siphoning capital and the wealth of the country diverted into private capital. And this private capital is appropriated, is assumed, the collective wealth of the country is assumed to be private capital, and interestingly, even using this private capital to develop industries, they are not ready to do this. So the scorecard of capitalist development here in Nigeria ultimately is a zero scorecard. And which is why the strategy of labor must not just be seeking to put pressure on government, to implement policies that we know that it will ultimately not be willing to implement.
Right.
And which is why a second strategy is needed. And this strategy, we must point out that it goes beyond just the trade unions. This strategy and tax is a tax for the collectivity of the entirety of the mass of the working people. They need to build a political movement. They need to call on all of the left alternative groups who think differently from the ruling class, who know that the wealth of this country, if put together, is collectively enough to begin to develop Nigeria, to begin to develop the whole of West Africa. We need to launch ourselves as a political movement and pose clear-cut agenda that Nigeria is rich enough for free qualitative education to be provided, not just for children. And it's disgraceful that you have a ruling class in power. We are currently, going by their own statistics, there are over 20 million children not in any school in this country, and practically nothing is being done, to reverse this. And the same goes to the health sector and all other sectors of of the economy in the country, and which is why the strategy and methodology of labor, alongside the entirety of the mass of the working people, is first and foremost to provide the necessary education to provide the education to understand that the ruling class, represented by the Tinubu regime, or represented by any faction of the ruling class currently, will not take this country each step forward from where we are.
Yeah.
Arriving at that consciousness takes us to the next step, and that next step is that how do you begin to organize against the ruling class? And that process of organization is what is currently missing. But again, I must return back to commending the Labour leadership currently with its steps and claim in wanting to reclaim the Labour Party. Yeah. But again, how do you define a reclaimed Labour Party? How should that party look like? And it must be clear. You must have a Labour Party where workers will not just be voters but can also be voted for. But workers cannot be voted for with the characters of how this Labour Party has been run since 2002, making tickets only available for the highest bidders. Again too, a Labour Party cannot be reclaimed if in its manifesto it says that it wants the socialist construction of Nigeria. It says in that same manifesto that it wants social democracy, and you have candidates who do not even understand what socialism is or do not understand what social democracy is. It means that Labour has a second role to play to provide the necessary education as to what Labour Party is, as to what its program is, and challenge the rest of all of us to come into this party, to grab the structures of this party and commence the process of creating a program. And it's sad that in the thick of struggle, for a new minimum wage, we have not read any statement from Labour Party, either from the so-called Aburu leadership or even from the transitional committee program. Of course, it is not impossible that the transitional committee is focused on just organizing the national convention. But a Labour Party, a party of the mass of the working people, must be on the side of the people when it's engaged in any struggle at any point in time. Supporting those struggles, using that as an instrument to call workers, to call people to join it, and putting forward that in power it will provide a clear alternative program as different from the one workers are currently struggling against.
Perspective on the measures that Labour has taken in order to ensure that the demand for a higher wages, minimum wage, does not lead to economic instability or bankruptcy, as suggested by government critics.
Now, let me point out that Labour, in fact, those of us in alternative socialist movement, and indeed, not just us, and indeed, Labour itself, must point out that the private sector has been quoted as saying that they can't afford such an huge wage. The simple response for them is that in other climes, in other civilized environments, when companies make such pronouncement, government will take steps to take them over automatically, to nationalize them, provide all of the necessary funding, and ensure that those corporations or establishments are run and managed. We must not just leave this within the framework of the private sector. We must go to the states and local government, because the governors are also presented as one instrument that are unable to pay. But interestingly, just yesterday or some 48 hours ago, Alex Otti, the Labour Party governor, in the East, has announced that they will pay whatever minimum wage is agreed upon. And this willingness to announce itself is an indication that all states can pay. We must raise the first slogan, because this is where we must also challenge Labour leaders. Whatever figure is arrived at, it is not a Luther stop. It must be willing, just like it has done in Imo State the last time, even though Mr. President was attacked in Imo when it went on negotiation for wages for workers who have been on strike in that state. We must say that we will be willing to call a national general strike, even for if one single state says they are unable to pay, and challenge that governor opens the accounts of the states, open the accounts, bring the figures, how much is expended on security. The whole security votes are funds that automatically disappear into the private pocket of Mr. Governor without no account of how this money is expended. All of the PAs, who are these PAs? What is their salaries? Compared, and the time has come that Labour must begin to raise the slogan. We cannot have senators, we cannot have public representatives who are not earning wages. So and this is one of the key clear-cut slogan that we must pose as we join the Labour Party, as we call on workers to join the Labour Party, as candidates who want to stand as tickets on a party that claims to represent the mass of the working people. These candidates must first raise their hands to the mass of the public and say that they will earn the average skill wage of the minimum wage of the country. Because, like a philosopher Engels points out, if you earn the wages of those who live in a palace, you are going to conduct yourself as those who live in a palace. If you are a worker representative, you must earn the average wage of what a worker earns. So the members of our own organization, Movement of Socialist Alternative, if they were to stand as candidates for any public office, will make a public pronouncement to say that they are going to earn the wages, the average wage of a skilled worker in Nigeria. And I think it is high time to begin to also popularize the slogan that our public officers must come down from the heavens, the heavenly wages they earn. Let them return back to earth and begin to earn minimum wage. Because if they earn minimum wage, they will see the necessity why a minimum wage of 6 figures, of 615 originally put forward, is not too fantastic.
Although you've actually initiated and elaborated more on this, Nigerians themselves have actually questioned why the country continues to operate a bicameral legislature. And one begins to wonder that these so-called leaders or ruling elite have continued to spend recklessly with reckless abandonment the funds, the public funds. For example, questions are being raised about the over 10 presidential air fleets that we have, why there was a 300% increment on judges' salaries, and the 80 billion that were the president financed himself and his vice president within a year, as well as the over 100. Exactly. We also talk about the 90 billion that was expended on Hajj and all the rest of it. So the question I would like to get from you, comrade, is what steps is Labour taking to ensure that its advocacy for a higher wage, minimum wage, is balanced with the economic realities faced by both the public and the private sector?
I'm happy that you have even indicated what these economic realities are. Yeah. The economic reality is that the country is rich. Because if Mr. President can spend all of these huge resources, Mr. President announced in less than 2 months of the increase of the pump price from 167 to 650 that Nigeria made trillions of naira. And these trillions of naira became largesse that were shared around all of the governors. So Nigeria is too fantastically rich for anybody to put any wolf over our eyes to say that the country is what is poor. But you have raised another fundamental question. What strategy, what program needs to be put in place to take us forward beyond where we are currently? And those strategies, again, too, we must first begin by saying that the advocacy that the trade unions are doing, traditionally, within the framework of bourgeois laws, are not its advocacy. Okay. But we must commend them for doing this. I'm trying to say this to think that we shouldn't all go and sit aside, and watch events and think that the trade unions will perform this tax for us. This tax is collectively for the mass of the working people themselves. And interestingly, have we sat folding our hands? The answer is no. We have not just had the first year of the Tinubu regime. We have had 25 years of bourgeois democracy. Yeah. The longest so far of the first, second, and the third republic that never took off. What does all of this say so far to all of us in relation to bourgeois rule? It clearly puts forward the point that these characters will not act or conduct themselves any differently. But what key lessons are we also to learn from these past 25 years? Nigerians have struggled. All goods to the trade unions, again, providing this leadership. Nigerians have struggled against deregulation through all of the series of general strikes that became near insurrectional states. Nigerians struggled again through the NSAS movement. All of these were mass movement, challenging the ruling class as to its conduct of the affairs of this country. And if you ask me, all of these have provided key lessons for the mass of the working people and for all change seekers. And what are those key lessons? And those key lessons, to a certain extent, were manifested in the 2023 election. First, in the emergence of what was referred to as the obedient movement. In a volume of millions of young people who wrongly felt that the character of Obi was a representation of that change. But we must acknowledge this expectation of the mass of these millions of people for a different Nigeria, distinct and different, as either put forward by the PDP or the APC. Where we fault the obedient movement is in backing another member of the ruling class who offers a program that is not any different from the same program that the main ruling class are offering. But that error will not be the error of this mass of young people. It is the weakness of the current socialist consciousness, the absence of a deep-rooted revolutionary movement in Nigeria to build itself forward and project itself as an alternative.
Now, comrade, let me quickly get that, because that is also fundamental. Earlier on, you mentioned the need for the Labour Party itself to take over the structure of the Labour Party itself. Now, could you elaborate, please, on your organization's support for reclaiming the Labour Party and its vision of rebuilding it as a party of struggle with a socialist agenda, sir?
Well, like we have pointed out, the manifesto of the Labour Party outrightly uses the word socialism in its manifesto. Again, too, it contradicted itself when in another section it uses the word social democracy. But we could leave this aside. there will be no sowing any illusion that is going to just be a walk-in and a takeover. This party has been dominated by right-wing element all of this period.
Yeah.
You know, so it's going to take a struggle, and which is why it is important to point out that it is also very, very important, even outside of the Labour Party, to build an alternative movement.
Yeah, right.
Because if you do not do this, the Labour Party itself, registered within the framework of the bourgeois laws, again, too, the Tinubu victory in the 2023 election would not have been possible without the emergence of an OB challenging all of the votes that will have gone to the PDP. The Tinubu regime will still employ this strategy as we commence the preparation for 2027 election. And that's why it's important to tell people like myself, to tell people like Showore, to tell the rest of all of us who think differently out there, that we can't continue to think that we cannot unite our forces. We must unite our forces. There is a need to build a pan-broader left movement in Nigeria that will put forward a clear left program. Nigeria is workable. Africa is workable. The entirety of the wealth in Nigeria and in Africa, if democratically managed, can provide for the needs of the mass of the working people. I've had more opportunities to say this than before. That if the whole of West Africa were to be a single country, just the wealth from Nigeria alone, if the whole of West Africa is not providing anything extra, it's enough to cater for all living human beings in the whole of West Africa, and even for Africans in the diaspora who want to return back to such a new country. Mr. President has changed the anthem of Nigeria, you know, and we should laugh. What this clearly provides, it provides opportunity for people like us to point out why we hate this country. Because Nigeria, we hate thee. The mass of the working people hate what Nigeria is currently. To give us an anthem that allows us to put that into our consciousness every day, we should give him a round of applause for it. But the truth is that an anthem in rebuilding a country, you do not start with an anthem. You start with the lives of the mass of the working people. But we must again tell ourselves the truth. This tax is not for any sections of the ruling class. It's not for Tinubu, it's not for Peter Obi, it's not for Atiku. It is for the mass of the working people. It is for teachers, it is for workers, it is for lawyers, it is for all of the mass of all of us who are out there, who as Nigerians have no other country to go to. We are the ones that must bind ourselves together and put forth a program. And that program already exists. A program that begins with the fact that this country is rich enough, and if we democratically manage this wealth of this country with the philosophy and socialist program to say that we want to use this program to build industries. Take electricity, for example. How do you introduce apartheid? Because that is what the Tinubu regime has done. Whereas what it should do is to increase the megawatt production. It has introduced an apartheid system referred to as banding people in a category of band A, to provide 24 hours electricity to them and charge them more. What happens to the rest of Nigerians who are not in band A? Mr. President says these people should be condemned to darkness. That is what this program translates to mean. And interestingly, they feel this is a better choice. Let's have some few Nigerians who can pay for electricity, enjoy 24 hours worth electricity. But provided by a government, a workers' government that is ready to plunge its hand into the wealth of the country and use that wealth to develop electricity megawatts. It is not rocket science. Again, too, this whole circle of pump price increase regime after regime can be brought to an end. Building a refinery is not rocket science. This country is rich enough. The wealth of Nigeria, oil production for a week, can build modern day refineries for all of us. And this whole question of refineries and importing fuel will come to an end. But you know the Nigerian ruling class. The Nigerian ruling class are themselves the businessmen, the oil barons. They are themselves the marketers. Of course, they have fronts that market to import fuel. And what they do is to transfer this wealth to themselves as agents of importing fuel from Nigeria. And if you have these characters in the corridors of power, they are not going to build any new refinery for us, because they are making billions of dollars from those refining, from those importing fuel in as marketers. And it frees them from the responsibility of building industries, paying wages, paying taxes and all of the rest. So you have a ruling class that is not interested in building industries. And this character is that does not just started, but only painfully for all of us, you now have the worst sections of the ruling class in power, with no program as to how the economy will be developed. And like I've pointed out, it fails because one of the first tasks any new government must do is to study the past government and see what it has done that has failed. But interestingly, this failure is not just on the Tinubu regime. Every regime since democracy started in 1999 has arrived at the same failure. And to the extent now that you now have the World Bank and the IMF, sitting down and dictating policies through the central banks to all of us. So this is the cul-de-sac that the ruling class has put the whole lot of all of us.
Final thought, as Labour returns back to the negotiating table with the federal government, what are your advice as the table puts Nigerians' demands in order to meet at least the minimum demands of Nigerians and ensure that this strike action is in the best interest of the Nigerian masses?
Well, I think the first thing is to commend their efforts so far. All of the intimidations from left, right, and center, they have resisted all of this. Nigerians must applaud the labor leaders for this, even if for the first time since the Tinubu regime started. The second thing going from this is to use this opportunity to tell the labor leaders that the entities of Nigerians all over are behind them. The truth is that, and this is what the ruling class is ignoring, a new minimum wage means improved funds in the pocket of everybody. So whether they are from the north, east, south, or they are Christians, they are Muslims, or Ogun worshippers, or like me, they don't go to church, we are all going to benefit from a new minimum wage. So the labor leaders must have it at the back of their mind that they have the entirety of the support of the millions of workers all over the country this time around behind them, and that they must go into the negotiations today and don't be distracted. If they offer another ridiculous figure to them that doesn't clock a three figure, they should come out of that meeting, address workers, and tell Nigerians to continue with the general strike. But this time around, the appropriate measures of effective mobilization, and ensuring that the strike is effective, should be put in place.
Comrade Dagazola, thank you so much for your insightful perspective.
Thank you very much.